The cold woke her before the lamp. Lirien Snareson opened her eyes in the long pine dark of the lodge bed loft and lay one slow breath, looking up at the low pine rafter where the small ash fawn woodbird her grandmother had carved 70 winters ago hung on a thin braided horsehair cord at the center beam, swinging a quarter-finger width on the cold air that came down from the smoke hole. She listened for the wolf pine ridge. The ridge was quiet. The deep packed snow north of the lodge held its first light hush. Down in the south yard at the base of the lodge stair, Sella the snow wolf was a soft cream-white shape on the dressed stone step, ears up, tail still, looking north up the Snare-Line, listening for what Lirien was listening for and finding the same nothing. She sat up. The bed loft was cold to the breath. She pulled the heavy wolf-gray night cloak about her shoulders and went down the 7 worn pine steps in the dark, knowing each step by its wear mark under the heel. At the foot of the stair, she lit the small tallow lodge lamp with the steel and flint, and the lamp came up slow. The pale yellow glow spread across the pine plank floor and across the long oak trestle table. The pine window above the trestle table held the soot black of the night still, but at the very low edge behind the wolf pine ridge, there was the first thin pale of the first light coming. She had read that pale every wolf moon morning for 14 winters. It said the Snare-Line could be walked. She dressed at the foot of the stair. The russet and cream wool kirtle came on first over the long, thin undershift. Then the heavy, oiled leather snare belt at the waist with the small skinning knife in the horn and bone sheath at the right hip and the little soft leather pelt pouch at the left hip. Then the long, thick wool stockings and the tall, worn snare boots with the deer hide thongs cross-bound to the knee. The hooded fur-trimmed huntress cloak of deep wolf gray came down last from the iron peg by the lodge door, and she set it on her shoulders and drew the deep hood up over the silver ash double braid that fell to her waist. She bound the cloak at the throat with the small bone clasp her grandmother had carved from a wolf collarbone in the iron winter. The clasp had gone smooth in the 71 winters of its keep. It set against the porcelain pail at her throat, as easy as if it had been hers from her first breath. She did not light the great lodge hearth yet. The dressing bench fire came first, on her return with the wolf-moon morning pelt. That was the order her grandmother had set and her mother had kept. She mixed the oat and honey hunter's cake dough at the trestle table, oat flour, ground salt, cold-thawed river water, dark wolf pine honey, and worked it with the cold heel of her hand until it came off the pine bowl clean. She broke it into 7 small rounds, each the width of a strong palm. 7 was the number her grandmother had set. 1 for the keeper, 1 for the wolf, 1 for the apprentice, 4 for the snare folk who might come to the lodge bench at the weighing. She flattened the 7 rounds on the dressed stone of the hearth edge and laid the small iron hearth cover over them. She would bake them at the lodge hearth coal at her return. The hunter's cake of Snowpine Hollow was a slow-set cake. It set as the Snare-Line was walked. She took the long pine-handle snare staff from the iron peg by the lodge door. The snare staff was tall as her shoulder, dark with 70 winters of hand grease at the grip, blunt iron shod at the heel. It had been her grandmother's snare staff before her mother's. She set the heel of it on the dressed pine of the lodge floor and felt the small cold give the iron-shod tip made on the pine. the way the iron-shod tip of her mother's snare staff had given on the same pine at the same hour of the same dressing of every wolf moon morning of her mother's 23 winters of keep. She set her right hand on the cold black iron of the long, wide lodge door handle. She drew the door slow. The cold first light came in. Sela was on her feet at the dressed stone step. Before the door was the width of a hand open, and the cream-white snow wolf slid through the gap at Lyrien's left hip without sound and stood at her left hip on the dressed stone of the south yard, ears up, pale yellow eyes fixed north up the Snare-Line. Lirien drew the door to behind her and set the small black iron latch and stood a long breath at the step looking up. The wolf pine ridge was a soft soot black against the slow pale gray of the first light rising behind it. The packed snow of the south yard held the soft, rounded prints of Sela's four-paw walk from the night watch and the long, rounded bed print of where Sela had lain at the dressed stone step, waiting for the keeper door to open. There was no other print in the south yard. No man had come to the Snare-Line in the night. She set out north up the Snare-Line. The Snare-Line of Snowpine Hollow ran straight north up the wolf-pine ridge for 900 paces and turned east at the snare-block at the slack ice of the North Pond and ran east along the slack ice for 200 paces more to the deep snare at the slack ice edge under the great old wolf-pine. There were 9 snares set on the line. The first 3 were set for hare and small game and were checked first. The middle 3 were set for fox and lynx and were checked second. The last 3 were set for wolf and were checked last, slow, with the snare staff held at the cross grip and the small skinning knife loose in the horn and bone sheath. Each of the 9 snares had a name. The names came down from her grandmother. The hare snares were the 3 sisters. The fox snares were the 3 cousins. The wolf snares were the 3 mothers, named for the 3 snare keepers of the Snowpine Hollow line. Lirien, Mark, Lirien. She walked the Snare-Line at the first light at her grandmother's pace, the pace her grandmother had set in the iron winter, and her mother had kept and she kept now. 1 slow step in 3 breaths, snare staff to the left side, eyes on the packed snow, head turning slow at every 4th step to read the wolf pine on the ridge for the soft drift of pine needle on the cold air that meant a wolf had passed in the dark. The cold first light went pale on the wolf pine ridge, and the first thin white of the cold sun came up at the lower edge of the soot-black ridge. The packed snow of the Snare-Line went from soot-black to pale gray to clean cold white as the first light came up over the wolf pine ridge. The 3 sisters held 3 small white winter hare. Sela stood 5 paces back at each snare and watched. Lirien knelt at each snare and worked the snare wire with the cold hand and freed the hare and laid it in the long deer hide game bag at her hip and reset the snare wire at the wolf pine root with the small short snare pegs and stood and walked on. The 3 cousins held 1 fox at the second snare. Pale red, white-tipped tail, clean kill. She knelt and freed it and reset the snare wire and stood and walked on. The first and third cousins were empty. She did not reset them. The wolf moon weighing was at high noon, and the cousins ran the night and were not for the day set. She came to the snare block at the slack ice of the North Pond at the pale white of the cold sun, standing 1 finger width above the wolf pine ridge. The snare block at the slack ice of the North Pond was a long, flat-faced wolf pine stump cut to a single level height. the dressed flat top of the stump set at the height of a strong woman's hip, the flat face dressed clean by old Lirien white track in the iron winter and kept clean by every keeper since. The grain ran north-south on the flat. There was a small, smooth, shallow scoop at the right of the flat, a hand's width across, where the cold, slack ice water from the slack ice edge could be laid for the strike of a token. There was a small, rounded peg mark at the left of the flat where the snare staff was set when the keeper laid down the wolf-pelt for the slack ice laying. The slack ice itself ran clean and pale blue at the north edge of the snare-block, 3 hands' breadths thick, holding the cold pale of the cold sun. The 3 mothers were set in a slow east-running line under the great old wolf pine on the east bank of the slack ice. The first mother held nothing. The second mother, the mother named for her grandmother, held a tall, lean gray wolf, clean killed, the long gray body laid out in the cold-packed snow at the foot of the wolf pine, the pale yellow eyes fixed open on the cold first light. Lirien knelt slow at the snare. Sela stood 5 paces back, ears up, pale yellow eyes on the kill, tail still. The wolf was no wolf of Sela's. It was a long, lean gray of the deep north wolf pine, come down to the Snare-Line in the dropping dark of the night for what reason a wolf comes down. Lirien set her right hand flat on the cold, deep gray of the wolf's flank and held it there one slow breath. She said the slow even thanks her grandmother had set. Low into the cold first light, the words the keeper said when a mother held a wolf at the wolf-moon morning. The cold first light took the words. Sela did not move. She freed the wolf from the snare wire, slow and carefully, lifting the long gray body on the cross arm of the snare staff so that no part of pelt was dragged, and she laid the wolf on the long deer-hide pelt cloth she had folded into the deep game bag, and she reset the snare wire at the wolf pine root with the cold hand at her grandmother's pace, and she stood and walked the 4 paces to the snare block at the slack ice and laid the wolf along the dressed flat of the snare block at the single level height of the keeper's hip. The cold pale blue of the slack ice held under the wolf pine. The cold pale of the cold sun held a finger width above the wolf pine ridge. She did not strike a token at the snare block today. Her grandmother had struck the first king's bone token at the slack ice edge of the snare block in the iron winter for the Prince of 16 Winters, and had laid the token hand to hand into the prince's open palm, and the token had been carried for 47 winters of his reign, and laid back into his grandson's open palm on the night the old king died. That striking was not a wolf-moon morning striking. That striking was a keep striking. It would come again at the day the king of the line came up the south road of the Aldur-mark to the Snowpine Hollow Snare-Line. The grandmother had said it would come. The mother had said it would come. The daughter, walking the snare-line at her grandmother's pace at the cold first light of the wolf-moon morning of her 14th winter of keep, said it would come. She did not know it would come today. The third mother, the mother named for her, held nothing. She did not reset it. 3 pelts and 9 snares was a clean wolf-moon morning. The line had given enough. She lifted the long gray wolf onto the cross arm of the snare staff again and balanced it across the back of her shoulders for the long, slow walk south down the snare line back to the lodge door. Sela came up at her left hip without a sound. The cream-white snow wolf and the silver ash huntress walked the long, pale white packed snow of the snare line south at the slow, even pace, snare staff balanced across the back of the shoulders. 3 small white winter hare at the right hip and a pale red fox at the left, the long lean gray wolf laid across the back, the cold pale of the cold sun coming up slow over the wolf pine ridge at her left, the cold first light running gold white at last across the packed snow of the Snare-Line ahead of her. She did not think of the king of the line. She did not think of the Wolf-Warden at the lodge bench. She did not think of the village pack at the village bench, or of Erik Halnar pressing her at the Pelt-Bench at the wolfmoon weighing, or of the small, thin private pull at the center of her ribs that had set in her on the night her first howl had risen on the wolf pine ridge in her 3rd month of life, and had been caught by the first howl of a king's grandson at a hunt camp she did not remember. She thought of the keep. She thought of the slow, even pace. She thought of the pale white of the cold sun coming up over the wolf pine ridge at her grandmother's pace. She came down to the south yard of the lodge at the slow rise of the cold sun 2 finger widths above the wolf pine ridge. She set the wolf and the fox and the hare down in the dressed stone of the south yard, and she opened the lodge door slow, and she stepped through with Selah at her left hip, and she set the snare staff back on its iron peg by the lodge door, and she crossed the kitchen and knelt at the dressing bench at the south wall of the kitchen and laid the small dry pine shavings in the cold iron pan of the dressing bench fire and struck the steel and flint at the cold rim, and the small pale yellow pine shaving flame came up, and she set the small pine stick and the small pine billet on the pine shaving flame and stood slow and went out to the south yard and brought in the wolf first, the fox second, the 3 winter hare last, and laid the wolf along the long dressed pine of the dressing bench at the south wall of the kitchen, the long lean gray body at the single level height of the keeper's hip, the pale yellow eyes fixed open on the low pine rafter. And she took down the long, thin skinning knife of 50 winters from the iron peg by the dressing bench and set it on the dressed pine at the right of the wolf. And she stood a long breath at the dressing bench in the cold pale yellow of the dressing bench, fire coming up. The lodge held the cold pale white of the cold first light at the pine window above the trestle table. The 7 small oat and honey hunter's cakes sat under the iron hearth cover at the dressed stone of the hearth edge, slow set in the cold honey and water. The lodge hearth was cold still. She would light it after the dressing of the wolf. The dressing of the wolf came first. She set the small bone clasp at her throat loose at the cloak. She drew the deep hood back. The silver ash double braid fell down her back, pale and clean in the pale yellow of the dressing bench fire. The porcelain pale of her face caught the pale yellow soft. She set her cold right hand on the cold black iron handle of the long, thin skinning knife of 50 winters and lifted it slow, and she set her cold left hand flat on the cold, deep gray of the wolf's flank at the center of the long, lean gray body, and she said the slow, even thanks of the dressing again, low into the cold, pale yellow of the dressing bench fire, the words the keeper said when the dressing began at the wolf-moon morning. The cold, pale yellow took the words. She began the dressing. She dressed the wolf at her grandmother's pace and her mother's pace. The long, thin skinning knife of 50 winters opened the long, lean gray at throat line, belly line, and foreleg lines in 7 slow, even strokes. The long gray pelt came off whole. She laid it across the long pine pelt rack at the south wall, hair up, and set the small wood pelt pegs at the 4 corners. The pelt was a clean prime wolf-moon pelt the color of the deep north wolf pine in late winter. It was a pelt the king of the line could lay against his shoulder. She did not say it. The thought passed. She dressed the fox second. At half the time of the wolf, the small pale red pelt laid across the small pelt rack at the right of the long pine pelt rack. She dressed the 3 winter hair last, the small white pelts laid across the small wire rack at the right of the small fox rack. The dressing took the long, full of the cold pale of the cold sun, rising the second finger width above the wolf pine ridge. The dressing bench fire kept the cold, pale yellow at the dressed pine. Sella lay long across the dressed stone of the kitchen floor at the foot of the dressing bench, ears up, eyes half closed, watching the pelts hang. She set the dressing knife back on the iron peg by the dressing bench. She washed the cold red off her hands at the small kitchen bowl of cold thawed river water at the side of the dressing bench and dried her hands on the small dry strip of pale wool at the rim of the bowl. She crossed the kitchen to the long oak trestle table and lifted the small iron hearth cover off the 7 small oat and honey Hunter's cakes and set the cold rounds one at a time on the long pine baking board and carried the baking board to the lodge hearth. She knelt at the lodge hearth and set the small dry pine shavings in the cold black iron pot at the center of the hearth and struck the steel and flint at the cold rim, and the small pale yellow pine shaving flame came up, and she set the small pine billets at the rim of the small flame slow, one and one and one. The way her mother had set them, the way her grandmother had set them. The pale yellow flame took the pine billets and went deeper yellow, and the cold black iron pot at the center of the hearth came up to the warm yellow of the lodge hearth coal at the slow rise. She laid the 7 small oat and honey rounds along the warm dressed stone of the hearth edge and set the small iron baking cover over them, and stood and went to the kitchen window and looked north up the Snare-Line. The cold pale white of the cold sun was 3 finger widths above the wolf pine ridge now. The packed snow of the Snare-Line ran a clean cold white from the south yard of the lodge to the snare-block at the slack ice. There was no print on the snow but her own going and her own coming, and the soft rounded prints of Sella's 4-paw walk at her left hip. The small soft pat at the lodge door was a child's fist, low, careful, 3 soft pats and a pause and a 4th. Lirien crossed the kitchen at the slow, even pace and drew the lodge door slow. Sarah Linden was at the dressed stone step in her small wolf-gray huntress cloak handed down from her mother, the small ash fawn braid bound with the frayed cream cord. The cream pale of her face cold rosed at the cheekbones. She held a small folded square of pale wool in her small mitten hand. The pale frost blue of her eyes came up to Lyrien's ice blue at the threshold and held there. Mistress Snareson, my mother sent the small wolf-pelt mitten pair for the warden's tally. Bring it in, Sarah. The small girl stepped through the lodge door at the dressed stone step at the single level height with the kitchen floor and stopped at the inner side and waited for Lirien to set the door to behind her. Lirien set the door too. She took the small folded square of pale wool from the small mitten hand and laid it on the long oak trestle table and unfolded it slow. The small pair of wolf-pelt mittens was a fine small pair, the pale gray hair of the pelt run clean to the stitch, the cream-colored underleather pulled clean at the seam. Sarah's mother had stitched the pair at the small village bench at 3 nights of the 3rd bell of the night. The small pair would go into the wolf-moon weighing at high noon at the lodge bench, and Sarah's mother would have a half-coin of the village Wolf-Warden tally for the work. "It's good work, Sarah." "My mother says the pale gray is the slack ice gray of the deep wolf pine, and the warden won't pay the slack ice rate." "Your mother is right that it is the slack ice gray. She is right that the warden won't pay the rate. He'll pay the village rate. That's not the slack ice rate." Sarah watched Lirien at the trestle table. The small girl had been apprenticed to the keeper for 2 winters, and she had heard the warden's village rate and the warden's slack ice rate at the wolf-moon weighing 11 times. And she had asked the question every winter, and Lirien had given the slow, even answer every winter. The answer did not change. The answer was, the warden pays the village rate. The slack ice rate goes to the warden's lodge, stead, 3 leagues east. That is the keep of the line for 11 winters now. The keeper does not change the answer. The keeper waits. "Will the king come, Mistress Snareson?" The cold pale white of the cold sun came clean through the kitchen window. Lirien stood with her cold hand on the long oak trestle table at the side of the small pair of wolf-pelt mittens and looked at the pine window above the table. The small, thin, private pull at the center of her ribs that had set in her on the night of her first howl in her 3rd month of life, and had been carried through the 26 winters, and 3 months since had pulled once on the wolf-moon morning at the cold first light at the snare-block at the slack ice. She had not named it. She named it now. "He'll come, Sarah." "My grandfather Hallgrim says the king will come at the wolf-moon weighing." "Your grandfather Hallgrim has kept the deep tally for 43 winters. If he says the king will come, the king will come." Sarah did not ask when. Lirien did not say. The small girl crossed to the lodge hearth and sat on the small pine stool at the right of the hearth and took down the small iron baking cover and turned the 7 small oat and honey hunter's cakes one at a time on the warm dressed stone of the hearth edge with the small wood turning pin, and set the small iron baking cover back. The cold pale white at the kitchen window came warmer, pale at the 3rd finger width of the cold sun rising. The lodge hearth coal held the warm yellow at the center of the hearth. The boots at the dressed stone of the south yard were heavy. They were not Sarah's. They were not Hallgrim's. They were the warden's. Lirien set her cold right hand on the long oak trestle table flat, palm down. She set her cold left hand on the small soft leather pelt pouch at her left hip. She drew one slow breath. She did not look at Selah. Selah was already on her feet at the dressed stone of the kitchen floor at the foot of the dressing bench. Ears up, pale yellow eyes fixed at the lodge door, tail still. The small hard pat at the lodge door was not a child's fist. It was the silver pelt stamp at the end of the warden's chain. He always pat-tapped at the lodge door with the silver pelt stamp first. The keeper of the line did not ask why. She drew the lodge door at the slow, even pace. Erik Halnar stood on the dressed stone step in the green woolen fur warden cloak of the Aldur-mark with the silver pelt clasp at the collar and the silver pelt stamp on the chain about his neck. The pasty, cool, soft-handed warden, the pale, waxy, the high-colored chin, the thin lips pulled tight already on the cold, pale white of the second light, the sandy gray hair greased flat under the soft fur warden cap. The warden's dressed stone step set him at the same single level height with the lodge floor at the inner side. There was no half inch between him and her. The keeper of the line had never let there be a half-inch. Snare-keeper Snareson, Warden Halnar, the wolf-moon weighing of the Snowpine Hollow Snare-Line at the 72nd wolf-moon of the keep of the hammer-line of the Wolf-King's reign, at the keep of the Snareson-line of the Snowpine Hollow Warden, not the hammer-line. The pale waxy face went a finger-width higher in the color at the chin. The thin lips pulled a finger-width tighter. The cold pale of the cold sun came in under the deep hood of the wolf-gray huntress cloak at her shoulders, and lit the porcelain pale of her face cold clean, and lit the silver ash double braid at her back, the color of the slack ice at the snare-block. The warden's pasty, cool eyes came up to her ice blue and went down to the pelts at the long pine pelt rack at the south wall of the kitchen, and went up to her ice blue and held one slow breath. "You'll not correct the warden of the Aldur-mark at his wolf-moon weighing, Snareson." "I'll correct the warden of the Aldur-mark at any naming of the keep that is wrong, Halnar." The pasty, cool eyes did not go up. The thin lips set. The warden stepped through the lodge door at the dressed stone step at the single level height, and crossed to the long oak trestle table and set the silver pelt stamp on the chain down on the trestle pine flat-faced, and drew the small dark Wolf-Warden ledger from the inner pocket of the green warden cloak, and set the ledger flat-faced beside the silver pelt stamp. The silver pelt stamp held the cold, pale white of the kitchen window at its dressed face. The Wolf-Warden ledger held a long brown ink line of figures down its open right page. Selah had not moved from the dressing bench. The cream-white snow wolf stood at the foot of the dressing bench with the pale yellow eyes fixed on the warden. Ears up, tail still. The warden did not look at Selah. He had not looked at Selah in 11 winters of the wolf-moon weighing, and he did not look now. Sarah Linden sat on the small pine stool at the right of the lodge hearth, with the small wood turning pin in her cream-pale hand and the pale frost-blue eyes fixed on the warden. She did not stand. The keeper had not told her to stand. The apprentice of the keeper stood when the keeper told her to stand, and not before. The pelts. Lirien crossed to the long pine pelt rack at the south wall of the kitchen and took down the long gray pelt of the wolf-moon morning slow, 2 hands at the 4 corners, and laid the long gray pelt across the long oak trestle table at the right of the silver pelt stamp and the Wolf-Warden ledger. Hair up, lay clean, the silver-gray smoke down the back line carrying clean from the deep gray of the back to the white of the belly. The long gray pelt set the trestle table the color of the deep north wolf pine in late winter. The warden looked at the long gray pelt one slow breath. Village rate? Slack ice rate, Halnar. The mother held the wolf at the slack ice edge of the snare-block. That's the slack ice rate by the warden charter of the Aldur-mark. 2nd clause, 4th line. I'll set the rate, Snareson, village rate, 6 silver and a half. Slack ice rate, Halnar, 12 silver and a half by the warden charter. You'll not name the warden charter to the warden, Snareson. I'll name the warden charter to any man who weighs against it at my Pelt-Bench, Halnar. The pale waxy went from the chin up to the cheekbone. The thin lips pulled tighter. The pasty cool eyes fixed on her ice blue and held there a long, slow breath. He did not lift the silver pelt stamp. He did not write in the Wolf-Warden ledger. He set his pasty, cool, soft hand flat on the dressed pine of the long oak trestle table at the side of the silver pelt stamp, and drew one slow breath through the thin lips and let it out slow. 27 winters? and an unmated keeper at the lodge bench, Snareson. The village pack's been patient, my son Fenric's been patient. The pack's Pelt-Bench is the Pelt-Bench of the village. The Pelt-Bench of the village pays the village rate. The slack ice rate is for the pack keeper. My Pelt-Bench is the Pelt-Bench of the Snare-Line. The Snare-Line pays the slack ice rate. The pack bench is the pack bench. They are not the same bench. They will be the same bench at high noon. Snareson, Fenric comes at high noon. The village pack comes with him. The pack bench will set at this trestle table. The slack ice rate will go into the pack tally. You'll sign the pack tally with your wolf bone seal. That's the wolfmoon weighing this winter. The wolfmoon weighing of the Snareson-line of the Snowpine Hollow does not sign a pack tally with the keeper's wolf bone seal, Halnar. It signs a Snare-Line tally with the keeper's wolf bone seal, 12 silver and a half by the Warden charter. The pasty, cool, soft hand at the side of the silver pelt stamp went a finger width tighter at the dressed pine. The pale waxy went the deepest color she had seen at the warden's chin in 11 winters of the wolf-moon weighing. He drew the Wolf-Warden ledger across the dressed pine flat-faced and lifted the small black iron quill from the inner sleeve of the warden cloak and set the quill at the brown ink rest at the right of the ledger and dipped the quill at the small black iron ink bowl at the side of the rest and held the quill above the long brown ink line at the right page of the Wolf-Warden ledger. 6 silver and a half, village rate. Sign the pack tally at high noon. That's the warden's Writ, Snareson. The small, soft step at the side door of the kitchen at the south wall was an old man's step. The small, worn satchel strap creaked at the iron peg by the side door. The small, frost-gray cloak came in. Old Master Hallgrim Whitefoot crossed the kitchen at the slow, careful pace of 71 winters and laid the small worn satchel on the long oak trestle table at the left of the long gray pelt of the wolf-moon morning and drew from the satchel one short, single birch strip bar, slow, and laid the birch strip bar flat-faced on the dressed pine at the side of the small worn satchel. The birch strip bar held a slow, careful brown ink line of figures down its dressed pale length. The figures were dated at the right margin in the slow, careful brown ink of 43 winters. The figures did not match the Wolf-Warden ledger. The pasty, cool, soft hand at the side of the silver pelt stamp set hard. The pale waxy went the color of the slack ice. The thin lips parted one slow breath. The black iron quill at the brown ink rest went down on the dressed pine. Whitefoot. Warden Halnar. Warden's wolf-moon tally and the deep tally of the Snowpine Hollow do not match this winter, as they have not matched the 11 winters of your warden bench. 12 silver and a half is the slack ice rate. The mother held the wolf at the slack ice edge. The deep tally has it set at the slack ice rate. The keeper has it set at the slack ice rate. The warden has it set at 6 silver and a half. The keeper of the Snareson-line and the deep tally keeper of the Snowpine Hollow do not sign a 6 silver and a half tally on a slack ice rate pelt at the 72nd wolf moon of the keep. The cold, pale white at the kitchen window came clean through and lit the long gray pelt of the wolf-moon morning at the center of the long oak trestle table. The lodge hearth coal held the warm yellow at the center of the hearth. The dressing bench fire held the pale yellow at the south wall. The cream white of Sella held still at the foot of the dressing bench. The pale frost blue of Sarah Linden's eyes held still at the small pine stool at the right of the hearth. The long single silver hunt horn note that came up from the south road of the Aldur-mark at the south end of the Snare-Line was not Halnar's hunt horn. Halnar's hunt horn was an iron horn. The long single silver note carried up the wolf pine ridge clean and even and held 2 slow breaths in the cold pale white of the second light and went out slow. The pasty, cool, soft hand at the side of the silver pelt stamp went up off the dressed pine of the long oak trestle table. The pale, waxy face went the color Hallgrim's pale, frost-gray eyes had held at the side door at the small, worn satchel a long, slow moment ago. The warden of the Aldur-mark drew one slow breath through the thin lips. "That's the king's hunt horn. That's the king's hunt horn, Halnar." The cold, pale white of the cold sun came up the 4th finger width above the wolf pine ridge. The cold, pale white at the kitchen window held the long, single silver hunt horn note, a long, slow breath after the note had gone out, and Lirien Snareson stood at the long oak trestle table at the side of the long gray wolf pelt of the wolf-moon morning and listened. The cold, pale white at the pine window did not change. The silver of the note had gone into the pale white of the cold sun and would have to come up the south road of the Aldur-mark on a horse now, in the body of a king of the line. Erik Halnar drew the Wolf-Warden ledger off the dressed pine slow and set the silver pelt stamp back about his neck under the silver pelt clasp at the collar of the green warden cloak. He did not write the 6 silver and a half. He did not write the 12 silver and a half. The figure for the long gray wolf pelt of the wolf-moon morning did not go on the line. "You'll set the lodge bench at the 72nd wolf-moon weighing of the keep Snareson, when the king's column is at the south yard of the lodge. I'll set the lodge bench at the 72nd wolf-moon weighing of the keep Halnar at the warden charter rate, 12 silver and a half, the slack ice rate, by the 2nd clause, 4th line." The pasty, cool, soft hand at the side of the Wolf-Warden ledger drew the ledger off the dressed pine of the long oak trestle table and slid it into the inner pocket of the green warden cloak. The thin lips set. The pale waxy at the chin had not gone down a finger width. The pasty, cool eyes did not come up to her ice blue. He crossed to the lodge door, drew it open at the slow, even pace, and the warden cloak went out, and the lodge door drew to behind him slow. Old Master Hallgrim Whitefoot did not lift the short, single birch strip bar off the dressed pine of the long oak trestle table. He set his pale frost-gray eyes on Lyrien's ice blue at the slow, even pace, and held the look one slow breath, and looked back down at the short, single birch strip bar. "That's the first bar, daughter. 8 more in the satchel. Lay them at the long oak trestle table at the high noon of the test, Master Hallgrim. At the Snare-Line, not at the lodge bench. At the Snare-Line, at the long pine trestle table at the south end of the Snare-Line, the great old wolf pine trestle, yes." The pale frost-gray eyes held the cold pale white of the second light at the slow, even pace. He had carried the deep tally to the lodge bench many times in 11 winters, and had not laid a single birch strip bar at any of those weighings. He had laid the first bar today. The 72nd wolf-moon weighing of the keep had broken the 11 winter quiet at the half-coin east trade. Sarah Linden set the small wood turning pin on the hearth edge and crossed to the long oak trestle table at her grandmother's left side. She set her cream-pale right hand flat on the dressed pine at the side of the short single birch strip bar held it there one slow breath, and lifted it. The small girl had not been told to. The lodge bench had taken a third hand at the 72nd wolf-moon weighing of the keep without the deep tally keeper or the keeper of the line saying a word. "Sarah?" "Yes, Mistress Snareson." "Sit at the lodge hearth at the small pine stool. Turn the cakes. The lodge bench will hold." "Yes, Mistress Snareson." Sarah Linden crossed back to the lodge hearth at the slow, careful pace and sat at the small pine stool and lifted the small iron baking cover and turned the 7 small oat and honey hunter's cakes one at a time on the warm dressed stone of the hearth edge with the small wood turning pin and set the small iron baking cover back. The pale frost blue of her eyes held the warm yellow of the lodge hearth coal at the slow, even pace. The horses came up the south road of the Aldur-mark at the slow, even pace at the small 5th finger width of the cold sun above the wolf-pine ridge. Lirien crossed the kitchen to the lodge door at the slow, even pace and drew the lodge door open at the slow, even pace and stepped out onto the dressed stone step at the single level height with the kitchen floor of the lodge and looked south down the Snare-Line. Sella came at her left hip without sound. The cream-white snow wolf stood at her left hip on the dressed stone of the south yard, ears up, tail still, pale yellow eyes fixed south down the Snare-Line. 8 horses on the south road, 2 wagons, 2 pack mules. The captain of the King's Hunt Guard rode at the front, iron gray hair cropped short under the plain hunt leather tabard with the silver wolf mark, long bow at the back, long northern hunting knife at the belt, dark hunt cloak at the shoulders on a dark slate gray hunt mare. He raised the right hand at the south end of the Snare-Line. The column halted. The captain dismounted, walked 5 paces ahead, and stood one slow breath, looking north at the lodge, at Lirien, at the dressed stone step, at Selah, at her left hip. He raised the right hand again, slow, palm out. Lirien raised her right hand at the slow, even pace, palm out at the dressed stone step at the lodge door. The captain set his right hand back at the small pommel of the long northern hunting knife at his right hip. He stepped aside from the center of the south end of the Snare-Line and stood at the right of the center. The king came up the center of the south end of the Snare-Line slow. He had dismounted 3 paces back of the captain's halt line and walked to the south end of the Snare-Line. The long fur-shouldered black huntsman's cloak fell deep to the back of the riding boots. The silver wolf clasp at the collar caught the cold pale white of the second light. The deep slate blue wool tunic at the sun bronze of the throat above the silver wolf clasp. The chestnut walnut warrior tail bound at the nape with the worked silver clip carved with the wolf king's mark. The front locks falling loose to the temples at the same wind and sun lay her grandmother had set at the wolf-mark 71 winters ago at the Prince of 16 winters. The smoke-gray eyes set on her ice blue. Vorok stood at his left hip, pitch-black coat, silver streak markings down the back, white scar across the right ear, pale silver ice eyes fixed on Selah at her left hip. The 2 wolves held the look. They did not move. The king stood one slow breath at the south end of the Snare-Line, and the small, thin private pull at the center of her ribs that had set in her on the night of her first howl in her 3rd month of life pulled twice. Slow even. She did not look away. The Queen Mother dismounted slow at the right of the column, the pewter gray hair under the black hunting veil, the small dark hunt rosary in the left hand, the widow's slate-gray wool cloak. She did not come forward. The king walked north up the Snare-Line at the slow, even pace. Vorok came at his left hip. The captain came at the right, 3 paces back. The queen mother held at the south end of the column. The 8 hunt riders held at the slow, even pace at the south end of the Snare-Line. The 2 wagons held, the 2 pack mules held. The cold, pale white of the second light held the long, pale white packed snow of the Snare-Line clean from the south end to the dressed stone step at the north end at the lodge door. The king walked the 900 paces of the Snare-Line from the south end to the snare-block at the slack ice, and stopped one slow breath at the small, smooth, shallow scoop at the right of the dressed flat. He did not lay his hand on the dressed flat. He did not strike a token. He looked and turned and walked the slow, even pace down the Snare-Line south. Vorok at his left hip, the captain 3 paces back. He came to the dressed stone step at the lodge door at the slow, even pace. The dressed stone step set him at the same single level height with her at the inner side of the lodge door. She had stepped down off the dressed stone step at the slow, even pace as he came up the Snare-Line, and she stood now at the dressed stone of the south yard at the slow, even pace at the same single level height with him on the dressed stone step. There was no half-inch of advantage between her and the king of the line. The dressed stone of the south yard met the dressed stone step at one single level height, and the king and the keeper stood at that height. There was no half-inch on either side. Sella stood at her left hip. Vorok stood at his left hip. The 2 wolves did not move. The pale yellow eyes of the cream white snow wolf and the pale silver ice eyes of the pitch black Lycan wolf held the cold pale white of the second light at the dressed stone of the south yard. The king did not lift his right hand. He did not lower the long fur-shouldered cloak. He set his smoke-gray eyes on her ice blue at the slow, even pace, and held them there one slow breath, and the cold, pale white of the second light came up over the wolf-pine ridge and lit the porcelain pale of her face and the silver ash double braid at her back and the deep wolf-gray of the huntress cloak at her shoulders and the small bone clasp at her throat, the color of the slack ice at the snare-block. He drew one slow breath. Snare-keeper Snareson. Lycan King Tholen. The 2 names set at the dressed stone of the south yard between them at the same single level height and held there one slow breath at the cold, pale white of the second light. The names did not go up. They did not go down. The names stood the way the dressed stone of the south yard and the dressed stone of the lodge door stood at one single level height. There was no half-inch. My grandfather Elvar carried a small, flat, carved bone token of your grandmother Lyrien's, striking at the slack ice edge of that snare block for 47 winters of his reign. He laid it back in my open palm on the night he died. He laid 3 charges with it. I came up the south road of the Aldur-mark this morning to set the matter at the question. You are welcome at the lodge door of the Snowpine Hollow Snare-Line at the 72nd wolf moon of the keep of the Snareson-line Lycan king. The lodge bench is set. The trestle is at the long pine of the south Snare-Line at the great old wolf pine trestle at the high noon. The deep tally keeper has laid the first birch strip bar at the lodge bench at the 72nd wolf moon weighing. The warden of the Aldur-mark has not signed the Wolf-Warden ledger this morning. You will set the matter at the question at the long pine trestle at the high noon. At the high noon, snare keeper, at the high noon, Lycan king. You walked the snare-line at the cold first light at your grandmother's pace this morning. At my grandmother's pace this morning, Lycan king. My grandfather walked the king's snare-line at the iron winter of his 16th winter at her pace. He kept it for 47 winters of his reign. The pace did not change. The pace does not change, Lycan king. He did not say the mate bond word at the dressed stone of the south yard. He would say it at the long pine trestle at the high noon, at the snare-block at the slack ice, at the same single level height. That was the place of the first hunt. The third charge of his grandfather's deathbed was bind true at the place of the first hunt, not above it. He drew one slow breath, turned, and walked back south down the snare-line at his grandfather's pace. Vorok at his left hip, the captain 3 paces back. Lirien stood at the dressed stone of the south yard and watched the long, fur-shouldered cloak go down the snare-line south to the south end. Selah stood at her left hip. The pale yellow eyes did not leave the cloak until the king had remounted. She turned and went back through the lodge door and stood one slow breath at the inner side. Sarah. Yes, Mistress Snareson. Take the 7 hunters' cakes off the hearth. Set them at the long oak trestle table. The lodge bench will not weigh a pelt at high noon today. The lodge bench will sit at the long pine trestle at the south snare-line at the great old wolf pine trestle. Carry the trestle cloth and the 7 cakes and the small honey jar to the great old wolf pine trestle. Run. Yes, Mistress Snareson. The small girl was at the long oak trestle table at the slow, even pace. The cold pale white of the second light held the cold pale of the cold sun at the kitchen window. The lodge hearth coal held the warm yellow at the center of the hearth. The dressing bench fire held the pale yellow at the south wall. Lirien lifted the long gray wolf pelt and folded it slow, hair in, lay clean. A long, flat-folded pelt the color of the deep north wolf pine in late winter. She laid the folded pelt across her left forearm and crossed back to the lodge door and stepped out onto the dressed stone step. The high noon was 3 slow rises of the cold sun away. She walked south down the snare-line at her grandmother's pace, Selah at her left hip. The king's column held at the south end, at the slow, even pace at the high noon to come. The cold pale white of the cold sun stood high at the cold pale white of the high noon at the wolf pine ridge. The long pine trestle at the south snare-line was set at the great old wolf pine trestle 3 paces north of the south end. It was the trestle her grandmother had set in the iron winter, her mother had set in her keep, and Lirien had set today, alone at her grandmother's pace. The trestle stood at a single level height, with the dressed stone step at the lodge door, with the dressed flat of the snare-block at the slack ice, and with the king's right hand at the south end of the snare-line. There was no half-inch. The long gray wolf pelt of the wolf-moon morning lay folded at the right, hair up, lay clean. The 7 small oat and honey hunter's cakes sat at the center on the small dressed pine baking board, the small honey jar at the right. Old Hallgrim Whitefoot's small worn satchel sat at the left. The 8 more burnt strip bars of the deep tally lay along the trestle in slow, careful brown ink of 43 winters. Each line was the wolf-moon weighing of one of the 11 winters of Erik Halnar's Warden bench. The lines did not match the public Wolf-Warden ledger. The 11 snare folk of the 3 valley villages stood in a long, even line along the east edge of the long pine trestle, called by name by old Halgrim Whitefoot in the long, slow rise of the cold sun between the second light and the high noon. Each held a slow, careful brown ink tally of his or her own, the half coin paid against what the warden charter named at the slack ice rate. Erik Halnar stood at the south side of the long pine trestle, the silver pelt stamp at his chain, the pale waxy at the chin, the thin lips set, the green warden cloak at the shoulders. He had brought back his son Fenrik and 3 of the village pack from the village bench. Fenrik Halnar's wolf-pelt half-cloak at his shoulders, sandy gray braid down his back. He stood at his father's left hand and looked at Lirien, and did not look down. The Lycan king stood at the north side of the long pine trestle at the same single level height with Lirien. The long fur-shouldered black huntsman's cloak, the silver wolf clasp at the collar, the silver hunt horn at his chest, Borak at his left hip, the captain 3 paces back, the queen mother at the south end of the column with the pewter gray hair under the black hunting veil, the small dark hunt rosary in the left hand, the 8 hunt riders, 2 wagons, 2 pack mules held at the slow, even pace. Selah stood at Lyrien's left hip. Sarah Linden stood at Lyrien's right hand at 3 paces back, the small wolf-gray huntress cloak at her shoulders, the small ash fawn braid bound with the frayed cream cord, the cream pale of her face cold-rosed at the cheekbones, the pale frost blue of her eyes on the long pine trestle. Old Halgrim Whitefoot stood at the west side of the long pine trestle at the slow, even pace, at the slow, careful pace of 71 winters. The pale frost-gray eyes held the cold, pale white of the cold sun at the high noon at the slow, even pace. The Lycan king set his right hand on the dressed pine of the long pine trestle at the center of the trestle. Palm down, fingers spread. The cold, pale white of the cold sun at the high noon caught the worked silver clip carved with the wolf king's mark at the nape of the chestnut walnut warrior tail. He drew one slow breath. Wolf-Warden of the Aldur-mark. Lycan king? At the 72nd wolf moon of the keep of the Snowpine Hollow Snare-Line, the warden of the Aldur-mark has weighed the wolfmoon pelts of the Snare-Line at 6 silver and a half on a slack ice edge wolf pelt of the keeper's striking. The warden charter of the Aldur-mark, 2nd clause, 4th line, sets the slack ice rate at 12 silver and a half on a slack ice edge wolf pelt of a keeper's striking at a snare line of 72nd wolf moon and older. The warden has weighed it at half. The half has gone east 3 leagues to Halnar's lodge stead for 11 winters. The warden weighs by the warden's tally, Lycan king. The warden's tally is the warden's tally. The deep tally keeper of the Snowpine Hollow has laid the deep tally at the long pine trestle at the high noon. Halnar. The deep tally is the slow, careful brown ink of 43 winters. The deep tally does not match the warden's tally. The 11 snare folk of the 3 valley villages stand at the east edge of the long pine trestle at the high noon. They hold the half-coin tallies of the 11 winters of your warden bench. The half-coin tallies do not match the warden's tally. The keeper of the Snareson-line stands at the north side of the long pine trestle at the slow, even pace at the high noon. She doesn't match the warden's tally. The wolf king stands at the north side of the long pine trestle at the slow, even pace at the high noon. He doesn't match the warden's tally. The warden's tally is alone at the high noon. The pale waxy at the chin went down. The thin lips drew tight. The pasty cool soft hand at the silver pelt stamp on the chain went a finger width tighter at the chain. The Warden Charter, Lycan King. The Warden Charter, Halnar, 2nd clause, 4th line, 12 silver and a half. The deep tally has it. The 11 half-coin tallies have it. The keeper has it. The Wolf King has it. The cold pale white of the cold sun at the high noon held the long pine trestle still. The 11 snare folk at the east edge of the long pine trestle did not move. The pale frost-gray eyes of old Hallgrim Whitefoot at the west side of the long pine trestle did not move. The pale yellow eyes of Selah at the foot of the great old wolf pine at Lyrien's left hip did not move. The pale silver ice eyes of Vorok at the king's left hip did not move. The smoke-gray eyes of the Lycan king held the pasty cool eyes of the warden of the Aldur-mark at the slow, even pace. Erik Halnar, by the Warden Charter of the Aldur-mark, 9th clause, 11th line, at the finding of a tally difference of more than 1 half-coin in 2 coins paid at a snare-line in any 1 wolf-moon weighing of any wolf-moon of any winter of the Warden's bench, with the deep tally-keeper of the snare-line, and the keeper of the snare-line and the half-coin tallies of the snare-folk of the 3 valley villages standing in agreement against the warden's tally. The warden of the Aldur-mark stands removed from the warden bench at the slow, even pace at the high noon of the finding. You stand removed from the Wolf-Warden bench of the Aldur-mark at this high noon. Halnar, the silver pelt stamp at your neck does not stamp another pelt. The green warden cloak does not weigh another tally. You will lay the silver pelt stamp on the long pine trestle at the slow, even pace. The captain of the king's hunt guard will receive it. The pasty, cool, soft hand at the silver pelt stamp on the chain held 1 slow breath at the chain. The thin lips drew. The pale waxy at the chin held still. Erik Halnar, at his father's left hand, drew 1 slow breath. The wolf-pelt half-cloak at his shoulders, he set his right hand on the small pommel of the long northern hunting knife at his right hip. The captain of the king's hunt guard at the right of the king set his right hand on the small pommel of his own long northern hunting knife at his right hip at the same slow, even pace at the slow, even breath. 3 of the king's hunt riders at the south end of the column dismounted slow at the slow, even pace, and set their right hands on the small pommels of their own long northern hunting knives at their right hips at the same slow, even breath. Vorok at the king's left hip drew his pale silver ice eyes off the long pine trestle and set them on Erik Halnar at 3 paces back of his father's left hand. The cold, pale white of the cold sun at the high noon held the long pine trestle still. Erik Halnar lifted the silver pelt stamp on the chain at his neck. Slow. He drew the chain over his sandy gray head. Slow. He set the silver pelt stamp on the dressed pine of the long pine trestle at the center of the trestle, 3 finger widths south of the king's right hand at the slow, even pace. The silver pelt stamp held the cold, pale white of the cold sun at its dressed face. The chain coiled at the dressed pine at the slow, even pace. The captain of the king's hunt guard came forward at the slow, even pace and lifted the silver pelt stamp on the chain at the slow, even pace and laid it in the small pelt stamp pouch at his belt and stepped back to 3 paces of the king's right hand at the slow, even pace. He did not look at Halnar. He looked at the long pine trestle. You and your son, Fenric, and the 3 of the village pack will go south to the south end of the Snare-Line at the slow, even pace, and stand at the slow, even pace at the south end of the column under the cold, pale white of the cold sun at the high noon at the Queen Mother's right hand for the slow, even pace of the writing of the writ at the trestle. You will stand without a knife at the right hip. The hunt rider at the south end of the column will collect your knife at the slow, even pace as you pass. Halnar lifted the long, northern hunting knife at his right hip, slow, and lowered it onto the dressed pine 3 finger widths south of where the silver pelt stamp had lain. He turned and walked south down the Snare-Line. Fenric followed, setting his knife on the trestle as he passed. The 3 of the village pack followed, each setting his knife on the trestle. The 5 long northern hunting knives lay along the dressed pine. The captain collected the 5 long northern hunting knives at the slow, even pace, and laid them in the small pelt knife pouch at the right of his belt, and stepped back to 3 paces of the king's right hand at the slow, even pace. The Lycan king drew the long, fur-shouldered cloak open at the silver wolf clasp slow, and drew the small, flat-carved bone token of his grandfather Ealvar from beneath the deep slate-blue wool tunic. The bone was the color of a wolf collar bone of 71 winters of carrying. The dressed face held a small, careful mark at the center, the wolf mark of old Lirien white track, struck at the slack ice edge in the iron winter. He set the bone token on his open palm at the center of the long pine trestle, at the same single level height as Lyrien's open palm. Strike for the line, not the lord. Let no Wolf-Warden stand between throne and Snare-Line. Bind true at the place of the first hunt, not above it. The 3 deathbed charges of King Ealvar Tholan the Wolf King at the night of his death 2 winters ago. He laid the bone token in my open palm with the 3 charges. He carried the bone token at his throat for 47 winters of his reign. Old Lirien white track struck it at the slack ice edge of the snare-block in the iron winter at the Prince of 16 winters at the wolf-moon weighing of the keep before this one. She laid it hand to hand into the prince's open palm at the slack ice edge at the slow, even pace, the line of the keeper and the line of the king at the same single level height. There was no half-inch. At the same single level height, Lycan king, there was no half-inch. At the high noon of the 72nd wolf moon weighing of the keep of the Snareson-line of the Snowpine Hollow Snare-Line, the king of the line will lay the bone token of his grandfather back into the open palm of the keeper of the line at the slack ice edge of the snare block at the same single level height. The keeper of the line will strike a second small flat carved bone token at the slack ice edge of the snare block from the wolf collar bone of the long gray wolf pelt of the wolf moon morning of this winter. The keeper of the line will lay the second bone token hand to hand into the open palm of the king of the line at the same single level height. The line of the keeper and the line of the king will hold the bone token of 71 winters and the bone token of this wolf moon morning at the slack ice edge of the snare block at the same single level height. There will be no half-inch. There will be no half-inch. Lycan king. The Lycan king closed his open palm slow about the bone token. He drew the cloak too at the silver wolf clasp and walked north up the Snare-Line at his grandfather's pace, Vorok at his left hip, the captain 3 paces back. Lirien lifted the long gray wolf pelt and laid it across her left forearm and walked north at her grandmother's pace. Sela at her left hip, Sarah Linden 3 paces back. Old Hallgrim Whitefoot followed at the slow, careful pace of 71 winters with the small, worn satchel and the 9 birch strip bars. The 11 snare folk held at the east edge of the long pine trestle and watched. They came to the snare block at the slack ice at the slow, even pace. The slack ice held cold pale blue at the north edge of the snare block. The dressed flat of the snare block held cold pale white at the slow, even pace. The small, smooth, shallow scoop at the right of the dressed flat held a hand's width of the cold, pale blue, slack ice water from the slack ice edge. The Lycan king opened his right hand at the slow, even pace at the center of the dressed flat of the snare block at the same single level height with Lyrien's open right hand at the slow, even pace at the dressed flat. The small, flat, carved bone token of King Alvar Tholin, the Wolf King held at the center of the king's open palm. The dressed face of the bone held the small wolf mark of old Lirien White Track. The cold, pale blue of the slack ice held the bone token at the slow, even pace. He laid the bone token slow into Lyrien's open palm at the dressed flat of the snare block at the same single level height. The small, thin private pull at the center of her ribs that had set in her on the night of her first howl in her 3rd month of life pulled 3 times slow at the slow, even pace. She closed her open palm slow about the bone token. She laid the long gray wolf pelt across the dressed flat at the slow, even pace. She drew the long, thin skinning knife of 50 winters from the horn and bone sheath, lifted the small wolf collar bone from the right of the pelt, and laid it in the small, smooth, shallow scoop at the slack ice edge. She drew the small striking stone of 71 winters from the small, soft leather pelt pouch at her left hip. A small, smooth river stone the color of the slack ice, laid here by old Lirien White Track in the iron winter, carried by Lirien for 14 winters. She laid the striking stone at the dressed face of the small wolf collarbone slow. She drew 1 slow breath. She struck the small striking stone at the dressed face of the small wolf collarbone at the slack ice edge, slow at the slow, even pace. The first stroke set the small wolf mark of the Snareson-line on the dressed face of the small wolf collarbone slow. The second stroke set the small line mark of the 72nd wolf moon of the keep slow. The third stroke set the small Tholin mark of the king of the line slow at the slow, even pace. She set the small striking stone back into the small soft leather pelt pouch at her left hip slow. She lifted the small flat carved bone token of this wolf moon morning slow at the slow, even pace. The bone token held the small wolf mark, the small line mark, the small Tholin mark at the dressed face. The bone was the color of a wolf collarbone at first carving, pale, clean, dressed. She held the bone token in her open right hand at the center of the dressed flat of the snare block at the same single level height with the king's open right hand at the slow, even pace. She laid the bone token slow into the king's open palm at the dressed flat at the same single level height. The Lycan king closed his open right hand slow about the small, flat carved bone token of this wolf moon morning at the dressed flat of the snare block at the slow, even pace. The cold, pale white of the cold sun at the high noon held the dressed flat of the snare block still. Sela held still. Vorok held still. The 11 snare folk held at the long pine trestle. The Queen Mother held at the south end of the column, the small, dark hunt rosary slow in the left hand. The Lycan King set his smoke-gray eyes on Lyrien's ice blue, at the slow, even pace, at the dressed flat of the snare block, at the slack ice edge, at the high noon, at the same single level height. He drew one slow breath. You were always mine, Huntress. The cold, pale white of the cold sun, at the high noon at the wolf-pine ridge, took the words at the slow, even pace. Lirien Snareson set her open right hand flat on the dressed flat of the snare block, at the same single level height with the king's open right hand, at the slow, even pace at the slack ice edge. At my grandmother's pace at the iron winter Lycan King. At my mother's pace at the second bell of the night, at my pace at the cold first light of the wolf-moon morning of this winter, there was no half-inch. The smoke-gray eyes held the ice blue at the slow, even pace. There was no half-inch, Huntress. The Lycan King drew the silver hunt horn from the black braided cord at his chest at the slow, even pace. He walked north up the snare-line 3 paces from the snare-block at the slack ice, and stood at the slow, even pace at the cold, pale white of the cold sun, at the dropping light of the 72nd wolf-moon weighing of the keep. His smoke-gray eyes set on the wolf-pine ridge at the north of the Snowpine Hollow. Vorok at his left hip, the silver hunt horn lifted at the slow, even pace to his lips. He drew one slow breath. He set the silver hunt horn at the cold first touch of the lips, and drew one long, slow, even breath through the silver, and the long, single silver hunt horn note went out clean and even, and held 2 slow breaths in the cold, pale white of the dropping light, and went out slow into the wolf-pine ridge. The wolf-pine ridge took the note. The cold, pale white at the slow drop of the cold sun took the note. The slack ice held the note one slow breath after the silver had gone quiet. The first wolf howl came up from the wolf-pine ridge slow at the long, single silver note. The wolf howl was not Selah. It was not Vorok. It was a wolf of the wolf-pine ridge, a long, lean gray of the deep north wolf-pine, the sister wolf of the wolf the second mother had held at the cold first light of the wolf-moon morning. The first wolf howl held one slow breath on the wolf-pine ridge and went out. The second wolf howl came up at the slow, even pace, 3 points north on the ridge. The third wolf howl came up at the slow, even pace, 5 points north and east. The wolves of the deep north wolf-pine answered the silver hunt horn of the Lycan King at the slow, even pace at the dropping light at the 72nd wolf-moon weighing of the keep of the Snareson-line of the Snowpine Hollow. Selah at Lyrien's left hip lifted her cream-white head and drew one slow breath, and the long, even cream-white wolf howl came up from her at the slow, even pace at the slow drop of the cold sun. Even, true, level. Vorok at the king's left hip lifted his pitch-black head and drew one slow breath, and the long, even pitch-black wolf howl came up from him at the slow, even pace at the same slow drop of the cold sun. Even, true, level. The cream white and the pitch black held the long, even howl, one slow breath at the slow, even pace and went quiet. The wolf-pine ridge held the silver and the 6 howls in the cold, pale white of the dropping light at the slow, even pace and let them out slow. The 11 snare folk of the 3 valley villages stood at the east edge of the long pine trestle at the slow, even pace and listened. Old Hallgrim Whitefoot at the west side of the long pine trestle stood at the slow, even pace at the slow, careful pace of 71 winters and listened. Sarah Linden, at 3 paces back of Lyrien's right hand, stood at the slow, even pace, the pale frost blue of her eyes wet at the cold, pale white. The Queen Mother at the south end of the column held the small, dark hunt rosary slow at the slow, even pace, and the pewter gray hair under the black hunting veil, and listened. The Lycan king lowered the silver hunt horn at the slow, even pace and set it back at the black braided cord at his chest at the slow, even pace. The cold, pale white of the cold sun went 1 finger width down at the wolf-pine ridge. He turned at the slow, even pace and walked back south to the snare-block at the slack ice at the slow, even pace at his grandfather's pace. Vorok at his left hip. He set his open right hand on the dressed flat of the snare-block at the slow, even pace at the same single level height, with Lyrien's open right hand at the slow, even pace. He set his open left hand slow over Lyrien's open right hand at the slow, even pace at the dressed flat of the snare-block at the slack ice edge. The cold, pale blue of the slack ice held the 4 hands at the slow, even pace at the dropping light. Snareson-line and Tholen-line at the slack ice edge of the snare-block of the Snowpine Hollow at the 72nd wolfmoon of the keep, at the same single level height. There is no half-inch. There is no half-inch, Lycan king. The cold, pale white of the cold sun went down to 1 hand width above the wolf-pine ridge. She crossed the kitchen of the lodge at the slow, even pace at the 2nd bell of the night. The lodge hearth coal held the warm yellow at the center of the hearth. The dressing bench fire held the pale yellow at the south wall. Sarah Linden sat at the long oak trestle table at the slow, even pace, the small wolf-gray huntress cloak at her shoulders, the cream pale of her face cold rosed at the cheekbones, the pale frost blue of her eyes on Lirien at the slow, even pace. Lirien crossed to the iron peg by the dressing bench and lifted the long, thin skinning knife of 50 winters slow off the peg. She crossed to the long oak trestle table at the slow, even pace and stood at the side of the small girl at the slow, even pace. Sarah. Yes, Mistress Snareson. My grandmother gave the long, thin skinning knife of 50 winters to my mother at the long oak trestle table at the 2nd bell of the night at her 12th winter. My mother gave it to me at the long oak trestle table at the 2nd bell of the night at my 15th winter, the night before the winter fever took her. I give it to you at the long oak trestle table at the 2nd bell of the night at the 72nd wolf moon weighing of the keep of the Snareson-line. You'll keep the snare-line at my pace, at my grandmother's pace, at my mother's pace. You'll walk the line at the cold first light. You'll dress the wolf at the dressing bench. You'll bake the 7 small oat and honey hunter's cakes. You'll lay the deep tally with your grandfather Hallgrim. You'll sign at the slack ice rate. You'll take no half-inch from any warden or pack or lord. You'll keep at the same single level height. You'll keep the line. She set the long, thin skinning knife of 50 winters slow into the small girl's open right palm at the long oak trestle table at the 2nd bell of the night. The small girl's cream-pale right hand closed slow about the long, thin skinning knife at the slow, even pace. The pale frost blue of her eyes did not go down. At your pace, Mistress Snareson. At your grandmother's pace. At my mother's pace. At your mother's pace, Sarah. The keep is yours. The cold, pale yellow of the lodge hearth coal held the long oak trestle table still at the 2nd bell of the night. The small flat-carved bone token of King Alvar Tholen, the Wolf King, held at the center of Lyrien's left hand at the slow, even pace at the long oak trestle table. The small, flat, carved bone token of this wolf moon morning held at the throat of the Lycan king at the slow, even pace at the lodge hearth at the center of the kitchen floor. Old Hallgrim Whitefoot stood at the side door of the kitchen at the south wall at the slow, even pace, at the slow, careful pace of 71 winters. The unbroken vellum letter of Erik Snareson of 27 winters of carrying lay on the long oak trestle table at the side of the long, thin skinning knife of 50 winters. The wolf-bone seal at the right edge of the vellum held the cold, pale yellow of the lodge hearth coal at the slow, even pace. At first light, daughter, at the kitchen table, the writ is at first light, the unbroken vellum is at first light. At first light, Master Hallgrim. The pale frost-gray eyes of the deep tally keeper of the Snowpine Hollow held the cold, pale yellow of the lodge hearth coal at the slow, even pace. The cold, pale gray of the first light came up at the kitchen window above the long oak trestle table at the slow, even pace. The Lycan king sat at the long oak trestle table at the cold, pale gray of the first light. The long, fur-shouldered cloak sat at the small pine stool at the side, the deep slate-blue wool tunic at the chest. He held the small black iron quill at the long sheet of unmarked vellum at the center. The two small, flat-carved bone tokens of 71 winters at his throat, of this wolf moon morning at hers, held at the slow, even pace. He wrote the writ slow at the slow, even pace at his grandfather's pace. The small black iron quill drawing the slow, careful brown ink across the long sheet of unmarked vellum at the slow, even pace. The writ was 4 short lines. The first line set the keep of the Snowpine Hollow Snare-Line at the Snareson-line at the slack ice rate of the Warden Charter, second clause, 4th line, at the 72nd wolf moon of the keep, in unbroken keep from the iron winter of King Eilvar Tholan, in the slow even pace of the line of the keeper. The second line set Erik Halnar removed from the Wolf-Warden bench of the Aldur-mark at the high noon of the 72nd wolf moon weighing of the keep by the Warden Charter, 9th clause, 11th line, at the finding of a tally difference of more than 1/2 coin in 2 coins, paid in the 11 winters of the Warden's bench, with the deep tally keeper, the keeper of the Snare-Line, and the 11 snare folk of the 3 valley villages standing at the slow, even pace. The third line set Halnar's lodge stead 3 leagues east at the slow returning of the 11 winters of half-coin tallies to the snare folk of the 3 valley villages at the slow, even pace at the keep of the Snareson-line. At the long pine trestle of the south snare-line of the Snowpine Hollow at the wolf moon weighings to come. The 4th line set the mate bond of the Snareson-line and the Tholan line at the slack ice edge of the snare-block of the Snowpine Hollow snare-line at the high noon of the 72nd wolf moon of the keep at the same single level height at the place of the first hunt, not above it. By the 3rd charge of the deathbed of King Eilvar Tholan, the Wolf King, he drew the small black iron quill back at the slow, even pace at the brown ink rest at the right of the vellum. He set the long sheet of unmarked vellum at the slow, even pace at the center of the long oak trestle table. Old Hallgrim Whitefoot drew the long, unbroken vellum letter of Erik Snareson of 27 winters of carrying from the small, worn satchel at his side at the slow, even pace, and laid it slow at the long oak trestle table at the side of the king's writ. He drew the wolf-bone seal at the right edge of the vellum letter, slow at the slow, even pace, and broke the wax at the slow, even pace, and unfolded the long, unbroken vellum letter at the slow, even pace. The vellum held one short line of the slow, careful browning of Erik Snareson of 27 winters ago. At the day the king of the line comes to the snare-line at the question, the keeper of the line will be at the slack ice edge of the snare-block at the same single level height. There will be no half-inch. The keep is the keep. Erik Snareson, 27 winters. The Lycan king drew one slow breath at the long oak trestle table, at the slow, even pace, at the cold, pale gray of the first light. At the same single level height, Snareson, there was no half-inch. There was no half-inch, Lycan king. Lirien set her open right hand flat on the long oak trestle table, at the slow, even pace, at the side of the long sheet of the king's writ. She drew the small wolf-bone seal of the Snareson-line slow from the small, soft leather pelt pouch at her left hip, and set the small wolf-bone seal at the long sheet of the king's writ at the right margin, and pressed it down slow at the slow, even pace at the cold, pale yellow of the kitchen hearth coal. The small wolf mark of the Snareson-line set at the long sheet of unmarked vellum at the slow, even pace. The Lycan king set the small wolf-bone seal of the Tholen-line slow from the small inner pocket of the deep slate-blue wool tunic at his chest, and set the small wolf-bone seal at the long sheet of the king's writ at the left margin, and pressed it down slow at the slow, even pace. The small wolf mark of the Tholen-line set at the long sheet of unmarked vellum at the slow, even pace at the same single level height with the small wolf mark of the Snareson-line at the right margin. The two wolf marks held at the long sheet of unmarked vellum at the slow, even pace at the cold, pale gray of first light. Even, true, level. There was no half-inch. Old Halgrim Whitefoot drew one slow breath at the long oak trestle table at the slow, even pace, at the slow, careful pace of 71 winters. The pale frost-gray eyes held the long sheet of the king's writ at the slow, even pace. At the same single level height, daughter, at the slow, even pace, at my pace, at your grandmother's pace, at your mother's pace, at your pace, at the small girl's pace to come. The keep is the keep. The keep is the keep, Master Halgrim, cold pale gray of the first light when pale white at the kitchen window above the long oak trestle table. The king's column held at the south end of the snare-line at the slow, even pace at the cold pale white of the first light. The captain of the king's hunt guard set his right hand at the small pommel of the long northern hunting knife at his right hip at the slow, even pace, and stood at the south end of the snare-line, ready. The 8 hunt riders held at the slow, even pace. The 2 wagons held. The 2 pack mules held. The Lycan king stood at the long oak trestle table at the slow, even pace at the cold, pale white of the first light at the kitchen window. He took the long, fur-shouldered cloak from the small pine stool at the side and set it at his shoulders at the slow, even pace, and bound it at the silver wolf clasp at the collar slow. He drew the silver hunt horn at the black braided cord at his chest at the slow, even pace, and laid it back at the slow, even pace. He set his open right hand on the dressed pine of the long oak trestle table at the slow, even pace. He set his open left hand slow over Lyrien's open right hand at the slow, even pace at the dressed pine. At the snare-line, Snareson, at the slack ice edge. at the same single level height, at the snare-line Tholen, at the slack ice edge, at the same single level height. He turned at the slow, even pace and walked to the lodge door at the slow, even pace and drew the lodge door open at the slow, even pace and stepped through the dressed stone step at the single level height with the south yard at the slow, even pace. And Vorok came at his left hip and the captain at his right hand 3 paces back. The cold, pale white of the first light came clean across the dressed stone of the south yard. Lirien crossed to the lodge door at the slow, even pace at her grandmother's pace, and stood at the dressed stone step at the single level height with the south yard. Sela at her left hip. Sarah Linden at her right hand 3 paces back. The long, thin skinning knife of 50 winters slow at the small belt at her side. Old Hallgrim Whitefoot at the side door of the kitchen at the slow, careful pace of 71 winters. The small, worn satchel at his side, the 9 birch strip bars, and the long, unbroken vellum letter of Erik Snareson of 27 winters, set in the satchel slow. The Lycan king mounted the dark slate-gray hunt mare at the south end of the column at the slow, even pace. The captain mounted at the slow, even pace. The queen mother mounted at the slow, even pace. The 8 hunt riders mounted at the slow, even pace. The 2 wagons drew slow. The 2 pack mules drew slow. The king turned the dark slate-gray hunt mare at the slow, even pace north up the snare-line, and held 1 slow breath at the south end of the snare-line, and looked north up the long, pale white packed snow of the snare-line, at the dressed stone step, at the lodge door, at the keeper of the line, at the slow, even pace, at the cold, pale white of the first light. Lirien set her right hand at the slow, even pace, palm out, at the dressed stone step at the lodge door. The king set his right hand at the slow, even pace, palm out, at the south end of the snare-line at the dark slate-gray hunt mare. The king turned the dark slate-gray hunt mare at the slow, even pace south down the south road of the Aldur-mark at his grandfather's pace, Vorok at his left hip, and the column went south at the slow, even pace at the cold, pale white of the first light. The cold, pale white of the first light held the long, pale white packed snow of the snare-line clean from the south end of the snare-line to the dressed stone step at the lodge door, at the slow, even pace at the keep of the 72nd wolf-moon of the line of the Snareson-line of the Snowpine Hollow, at the slack ice edge of the snare-block at the same single level height. There was no half-inch. The keep was the keep.